Welcome back to Killer Fun, where we explore the intersection of crime and entertainment every other week. I'm Christy.
And I'm Jackie.
And we're so glad that you're back with us today. Today, we're talking about the Netflix documentary series, limited one of Fear City, The Mob.
Fear City is so true.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, just the way it starts, holy moly. I can't even imagine living in New York City in the 70s.
This is what I'm saying. I think I grew up in a time where New York City was sort of considered a very scary place. Fear City is the most apropos title I've ever heard in my life for anybody who grew up in the time frame of the 70s, 80s, and then maybe early 90s before everything sort of changed. And I remember thinking, ooh, New York City, that's scary. But I went there as a kid with my parents, but we stayed on certain streets in certain areas, and there were certain things, right?
Yeah.
And we went with work, not my work.
Right. You weren't working at 8?
Yeah. Right? But we went with my dad's work, and so it was on a little ritzier end, right?
Yeah.
We were there for certain things, and I mean, this is me being a spoiled brat. Okay. We got to see multiple shows on Broadway. I saw Phantom of the Opera with Michael Crawford on Broadway.
Wow.
And I remember being in line to sort of find our seats. And this guy who was probably younger than I am now, but definitely older, in his 30s, turns around and says, "Oh, must be nice if I waited 30 years to see Broadway, but here you are." I remember giving him this look and mumbling to myself, "Just you wait. I got talent. I'll be on that stage one day."
Oh.
And I didn't say it because I wasn't that bold. But in my head, I was saying it, and I'm pretty sure my eyes said it.
That's awesome. Oh, and life took you a different way, but man, there's an alternate universe somewhere where Jackie's singing on Broadway.
You know what, though? I have sung and danced and done stage shows, and so it definitely was an inspiration.
Yeah, super cool. I remember my parents never wanted to go. My dad grew up in New Jersey, and he didn't want to go back to New York.
Wow.
He didn't. He was a little afraid. He didn't want to go. He knew how bad it had gotten. It wasn't like that when he was a kid, in the 40s and 50s when he lived there. It wasn't quite that way, and he knew how bad it had gotten, and he didn't want to go back. And then my husband and I went to New York in 2002, and my parents tried to warn us about how the people are mean, and you're used to Texas people where everybody's nice. Because we're just friendly. We got there, man, we met the most helpful people. When we obviously looked lost, people would help us. We were on the subway. We accidentally went all the way to the Bronx. And there was this very, very nice lady who said, "Okay, don't get off at the next one because you'll have to pay to get back on the train."
Oh, that's nice of her.
Wait 2 stops, and then you can go under, and you won't have to pay to get on the train again, and that one's safer anyway.
Oh, that's so sweet. It really is such a delightful city. I really do enjoy it. And in the 2000s, for sure, it was a really fun place to be.
But in the 70s, not so much. And we're going to talk all about that in the first episode. This limited documentary series premiered in July of 2020 on Netflix. It has interviews with both former mafia associates and FBI agents who investigated them primarily in the 1980s. Some in the 70s, some in the 90s, mostly 80s.
80s.
That's where most of this is happening. Which is weird to me to think that I was alive for all of this and just utterly oblivious.
It's true. But I mean, we weren't oblivious because like you said, our parents did warn us, and we knew that it wasn't a super safe place to be in the 80s.
Right. But I didn't know it was anything like this.
Well, this definitely sheds a light on the underbelly of why things were they were.
That's for sure. Most people appear as themselves. I couldn't find a lot of credits for the reenactments, but the reenactments they do have aren't verbalized. They're all underneath the interviews. So the audio that you hear is the interviews of people talking about what's happening. And they've kind of made those reenactments fit underneath their interviews, which I thought was really great. Though I kind of, if they'd gone for a comedic twist on it, I would have really kind of loved a drunk history style reenactments where they like mouth the words of the people. That would have been kind of funny. I know it's not a funny, it's not a funny show. It's very serious. There's a little like humor in it. These guys don't take themselves super seriously. I mean, they do, but not like completely. They can laugh at themselves.
They definitely have a perspective. I think that gives them a lot of space for the humor to kind of come in. But I think you're right. I think even then, they sort of understood what they were up against. They understood it was serious, but they kind of love their jobs. I mean, they really are geeky about their jobs. And when they talk about like certain agents with their certain set of skills sort of thing, they get that it's funny. But I laughed so hard because when they would interview these mob guys, like people who were involved with the 5 families, and they would drop words like this wise guy over here, and I just couldn't. I just lost it. But so I found it funny, even though it wasn't really funny.
Well, I found it funny, and it was also, I didn't realize they actually used that kind of terminology. I kind of thought it was for the movies.
I did too. I had to hit pause because I was like, really? Are we really saying these words? And he is not saying them ironically.
No, not at all. That's why I was so surprised.
It really made the whole thing delightful, though.
I agree. It was very fun. All right, so we're going to do things a little different this time. Normally, I spend time recapping, telling you all the interesting, all the little bit parts of things I'm going to be talking about. And you had a very nice suggestion. And it's a challenge for me that I intend to smash today.
I can't wait. It was kind of like a harebrained idea, I felt, but I pitched it anyways. And I'm so excited because you're going to do it. And I'm really happy about it.
This is the perfect one to start on. We're going to do a 5-minute recap. Super fast. I'm going to give you the gist, and that's it.
All right. I can't wait to hear this.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. Episode 1, Mob Rule. It starts with an audio recording of phone calls of mobsters, and it has this title card. 1970s NYC, a lawless city plagued by drugs, violence, and murder. And then they proceed to tell us how awful it was in New York in the 1970s, and that it was primarily the fault of the mafia, who profited off of their illicit activities to the tune of $60 to $100 billion a year. So much money. So we hear from former mob members about what it was like to rule in New York City and what some of their schemes were. And then we hear from FBI agents and how frustrated they were at trying to catch these almost untouchable groups. So there were 5 families ruling New York City: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. And then they had it really structured really well to protect the leaders. So there was a boss, an underboss. What a creative name. An underboss.
An underboss. I thought it was lieutenant, but I was wrong.
Yeah, that's all right. Then there were captains. Maybe that's where lieutenant came from. And they had different names in each family, the captains did. And then soldiers is what they were referred to as the grunt workers, basically. So law enforcement was pretty either ineffective or corrupt. So some young people created a group called the Guardian Angels, and they started out protecting the subway. 13 kids out trying to protect the whole subway and make it safer. Bless their hearts. So in March of 1979, Professor G. Robert Blakely, who was a professor at Cornell, held a seminar at that university to inform and instruct the FBI agents in the use of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which he had helped write in 1970. We call it RICO. So the FBI set up task forces for each of the 5 families, but the code of silence had protected these organizations for over 100 years, and that really meant that they needed to start using bugs to listen to the members' electronic surveillance devices. So they kind of walk us through how they made that all possible, both with warrants and then, very interestingly, how they were able to covertly plant these electronic surveillance devices. It's a story, man. And this really allowed the FBI to learn how the families interacted within their ranks and with one another, which I don't think that they really realized how much they interacted with one another until they got these bugs in. How deeply they were involved in labor unions, which came as a shock, and just how much control they had over not just New York, but the country as a whole.
As a whole.
As a whole. And that's where the first episode ends.
Amazing!
Look at me, like 4 minutes, man. I have a minute left.
That's awesome. And it was a good recap. Like,
thank you very much.
If you didn't watch this show, you've got to go watch it.
It's super fun.
This should tell you everything you need to know to keep listening and enjoying our conversation, because
that's right.
There are some really interesting things to talk about and like dive down a rabbit hole with.
Oh, yes. I really like this. I know you really liked this. Let's talk about who liked it and who didn't like it.
Okay.
Roger Ebert's website is still kept up, so they have reviews of new stuff on there. But I thought it was really fun because they did a review of Fear City back in July of 2020. And the guy who runs it, I think he mostly runs RogerEbert.com, and he wrote this review, and his name is Brian Tallarico, Tallerico. And I'm like, whoa, Rico. Just like the record. So he really liked it. I thought he had a nice observation about how it's kind of formatted like a procedural.
A little bit.
And I hadn't really made that connection, but I'm like, ooh, that's why it like works.
Now that he says that, that makes total sense.
Right.
Yeah. All it was missing was the boom boom.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So he felt like it was really elevated by the interviews that they did, particularly with the FBI agents, that they were charming, they were informative, that they cut it together really well. I agreed with this a lot. He said that it could have been really extremely dry material about all the wiretaps, but they kept enough of the human element in it to keep it interesting, which I thought, I was fascinated by all of that stuff. I thought it was great.
That was probably my second favorite part, second only to listening to them use things like Wiseguy, unironically.
Yes.
But I really did enjoy them talking about how they had to work the technology and how they had to go, quote, undercover a little bit and look for those opportunities to sort of sneak in and get it done. And then I totally geeked out on the old technology.
Yes, I thought it was amazing.
I couldn't believe they had to go put a bug actually like in the phone. And that not only did they put a bug like literally in the phone, which I recognize that they had to do back in the day, but they got in there because there was a problem with the phone lines. And then the phone line people, like the company people, come in and is messing with the actual phone, not the line. And I'm thinking, none of them have any geekiness or understanding, because if I'm the head of whole household, I'm like, what are you doing touching my phone?
Oh, no. You used to have to rent the phone from the phone company.
I mean, this blows my mind.
It could literally be a problem with the phone. That wouldn't have been out of character.
See, and I was like, I don't understand this at all. Like, how is this happening? How are they getting away with this?
Barely old enough to remember having somebody from the phone company come in, and the first thing they looked at was the phone.
Oh my gosh.
Because it was the easiest thing for them to replace if you had an issue.
I mean, I just can't even.
And it was the most likely culprit.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
See, and I guess maybe you're just old enough, but also I lived in a very techie family, so it's very likely that we just, I don't know.
Okay, so the only bone I had to pick with old Brian at Roger Ebert's review was that he was talking about the closeness that the FBI agents felt with these mobsters because they listened in on all their conversations.
Yeah.
And he said he even sent him a get well card when he was sick. And I'm like, no. He didn't send him a get well card because he felt bad for him. He was screwing with him.
He was screwing with him.
Messing with his head.
I think they even said that. I feel like he even said that, like that he liked to mess with him and send him these cards, and then they would get him and go, how did he know this?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, like, he missed the boat on that one because absolutely, it was a matter of psyops.
Yeah, but, though I love the innocence to be like, hey, they're cool. They really liked one another, even if they were on opposite sides. No. All right, so you know who didn't like it? Alyssa Wilkinson of Vox.
Really?
Yeah. How Netflix's new mafia documentary failed. Fear City takes everything at face value, and the results are tedious and vapid.
What?
So some of her criticisms, I will admit, are fair.
Okay.
And some of them I don't agree with.
All right, so hit me. Because I just feel like Vox, usually I am like,
usually I totally agree with. Yes. Well, we tend to be a bit more on the feminist side, as does Vox.
True.
So part of their issue was political because Rudy Giuliani's in it. He's a different sort of character in the 1970s and 80s New York City, even in 90s and early 2000s New York City, than he is now. And they basically hardly mention Donald Trump at all, which it's salient in 2020. And I see why they didn't want to go there, because they didn't want to make this a commentary on that presidency. But they said he really probably was a relevant character in this. They say it at the beginning of the third episode, which we're not covering, and I actually haven't seen yet, that if you were in real estate in New York in the 1980s, you had to deal with the mob. And that was just it. And they didn't talk about how Donald Trump dealt with the mob at all and what that means. So I can see why they didn't do it. I can see why they're criticizing that aspect of it, but I can see why the filmmakers made a choice not to.
I can too. I have to say, I really do empathize with the criticism, but I also agree that if you talk about Donald Trump in this time, and now that he's been president at all, you now put your whole story of the mob in that time frame in a different context, and you tie it up with it, and it'll never be a different story. There's 100 rabbit holes to go down. I mean, it's not just Donald Trump. There's 100 rabbit holes you could go down, like, that would be very interesting about other people we well know from New York City. It wasn't just Donald Trump. And honestly, Donald Trump has lawsuits, and there's all sorts of things pending pertaining to stuff coming out of that era now. Exactly. Which is another reason maybe not to include it, because those are active lawsuits at the moment. They can't really wrap it up in 3 episodes. No, they really can't.
Bring him into it.
I also don't want to get sidelined by the story of Donald Trump when I'm really trying to learn about these 5 families and how that works, because that is huge. And I have to tell you, seeing Giuliani talking about the old days and seeing him talk about who he was then, I was like, what a tragedy to see somebody who had such potential and did so many actual good things and had such a good head on their shoulders just be overcome and overwhelmed and decimated by the shadow of Donald Trump and whatever the heck he has on him.
Yeah. Exactly. So I see why they did it. I see why the Vox article is hitting that particular spot. I can see why they didn't do it.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
So, and she also questions, was Rico as unambiguously good as the series makes it seem? And I would say, probably not. It's probably not perfect. No law is perfect.
No law is perfect.
Even if the law is perfect, the people implementing it often have an agenda.
Right. I mean, unambiguously perfect. I mean, come on.
Right.
No, but it was a lifesaver to these detectives who couldn't figure out how to take down this massive network.
Right. For 100 years, they couldn't do it. And they finally had the tools to be able to do it.
Right.
So she says I'm not here to quibble with Fear City on the level of facts or even politics. What struck me is how bad it is as a documentary, which is where I start maybe not agreeing so much. She thought it was a boring choice to tell it from the view of FBI agents, which I don't agree, as somebody who enjoys procedurals, and I would guess she probably is not one of them.
Probably not.
Probably not.
I love me some Suits.
Yeah, yes, exactly. This is a fair criticism. She said that New York was legitimately in pretty rough shape in the 1970s. And that's totally fair, but they made it really sound like it was all caused by the mob. And it ignored any other factors that might have contributed to that. So you've got Vietnam's ending. We have oil crisis. There's all kinds of stuff with Nixon. There's a lot of political and social upheaval in the 70s that had little or nothing to do with the mob. Now, certainly, the mafia definitely caused a lot of issues in New York City, but it kind of ignores that there might have been other things going on.
I have to think about how to respond to that, because I hear what she's saying, but in this case, I think they're arguing in the documentary pretty well that because of the control that the mob had over labor and building and all sorts of city services down to the trash services. Right. It really was a chokehold on any respectable and normal progress that could have been made by individuals who were kept down in poverty or kept down in oppression because of this big net. It's like, okay, so a school of fish is in a net and a shark comes by. Is it the net or the shark that puts the fish at risk? Okay, you could say one or the other, but at least this fish could swim away and have a fighting chance if it wasn't for the net, and the mob was a net around New York City's neck. And had people had real jobs and been doing free market the way it was supposed to be doing free market, and had politicians not been bought and all of that for money from the top to the bottom, then maybe social unrest, certain sort of political processes, growth in social equality and racial equality and reconciliation, all of these things can be acted upon. This is a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You couldn't get to this top level without, dealing with the streets, and the streets were mob controlled. So I hear what she's saying about not mentioning the other factors, but I think this is a scope issue. This documentary was just not in the scope of how this helped or hindered other situations, but I think they make really good argument about its foundational situation.
Yeah. The mob certainly didn't make any of those situations better.
Okay, can I admit something? Can I be confessional?
Yeah.
What's really sad is some of the most beautiful buildings and things of that sort were all built because of the mob and the mob money.
I know.
And the contractors they chose. And I was like, first of all, why couldn't they have just been legit business people? Because they could have just made a lot of money doing it legit, and then maybe even made more. And second of all,
the beautiful Art Deco buildings, yes. Just
these buildings are gorgeous. And you're like, well, I don't know. Do we have to tear those down? Because
no.
I don't know.
No, we don't have to tear them down.
We don't have to tear them down, but it's kind of hard. It puts a little bit of stain.
But it's good to understand the behind the scenes of all that stuff.
It's super, because a lot of good people worked on those buildings.
Right.
Might have been mob controlled, but the people who really had the artistic design and all of that, they were in it because they were talented.
Right.
It just sucks that they were so like hooked into this horrible thing going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of, the people who worked on these buildings and stuff, she had another issue that they talked about the control that the mafia had over unions, but they didn't talk to any union members. They talked about shakedown money for grocery stores, and they didn't talk to any grocery store owners, the people who were actually affected. And I get that, it's easier to go with the big names. But how nice would it have been to add one more episode to this and hear from the people in New York City at that time who were legitimately affected?
That would have been nice.
It would have, I agree there. It would have added to it. And she says, women don't seem to exist in this world at all, which is largely true.
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty accurate representation. You mean there wasn't female bosses?
Yeah.
Of course not.
No, there wasn't. And she didn't like how much time they spent on the bugging of the mafia, which I really actually loved. I thought it was amazing.
I thought it was great.
Maybe I'm a bigger nerd than she is because I thought all of that was fascinating.
I did too. I loved it. I loved it down to the story about them hanging the bug on the lamp, and then there was just an extra wire that they didn't really hide. And I was like, see, cable management, people, cable management.
All right, well, we're going to take a real quick break, and we'll be right back with Is It True?
Scary stories aren't just for fiction novels. The most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened. Nightmares brought to life. I woke up to a man standing with his hand over my mouth, and I bit his finger as hard to lure us deeper into the forest. Tapping on my window thing was scratching her up and drag her into the woods. If you're fascinated by the morbid and sinister things this world is capable of, tune in to the Nightmare Society podcast. Available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast fix. New episodes every Thursday. Sweet dreams.
Thanks for sticking with us through that quick break. Now we have Is It True? So, really most of this is true. Now maybe you don't get exactly the whole story, but it's pretty true. Now maybe it's colored by decades of investigation and hindsight, but
yes,
overall,
it's true.
Yeah, it's true. So, but we can talk about the RICO Act.
Oh,
the Racketeer Influenced and Corruption Organizations Act. So basically what this did was it allowed the leaders to be tried for crimes that they ordered or assisted in. So when the boss ordered somebody be murdered, it was a soldier, the bottom of the rung, who actually carried out the order, or when they wanted a bank robbed, or when they wanted a home invaded, or whatever it was. It was the soldiers who carried these out. Now, the police throughout the 70s were able to get the soldiers sometimes and put them in jail for a year or two. That did absolutely nothing to the organization because there was always another soldier to take their place, just like in an actual army.
Hence the term soldier.
Yes, exactly. RICO allowed them to indict and convict the bosses, even though they didn't do the quote unquote wet work.
Yes. And it's funny because I think a lot of people probably just take that for granted today and don't realize that not only did we have to actually make that a law, but that it took so long for that to become a common strategy in prosecuting crimes. Texas has some really interesting ones. We've talked about it before. We've talked about it before where, you know, if you're linked a certain way to a crime, you can receive the same, like one of them received a death penalty. They weren't the ones who pulled the trigger. They weren't ordering it either. It was almost as if they were just an accessory.
They drove the car.
But they drove the car. And so they were prosecuted in the same manner. And so I think people take it for granted now. But at this time, it was revolutionary to think, finally, we can...
Yeah, we can go after the bosses. So what is racketeering activity?
Yeah, let's define that.
Well, it can be almost anything. Allow me to read you the list from the Wikipedia page. This is the abridged list. You're just, get comfortable a second. Gambling, murder, kidnapping, extortion, arson, robbery, bribery, dealing in obscene matter, dealing in a controlled substance, counterfeiting, theft, embezzlement, fraud, obstruction of justice, slavery, racketeering, which I'm like, that's what all this stuff is. Okay. Money laundering, murder for hire, embezzlement of union funds, bankruptcy or securities fraud, drug trafficking, criminal copyright infringement, bringing in or aiding people in illegally entering the country, but only if that is for financial gain. So like if you're helping somebody across the border and they have to pay you a bunch of money.
Okay.
Then it's criminal.
Like the coyotes and things. Yeah, okay.
And acts of terrorism. So pretty much everything. Anything? Yeah. But it really becomes racketeering when you do a pattern of these things. And that's 2 of these activities within a period of 10 years. 2 or more. Within a period of 10 years. So you have to have a pattern for this sort of behavior.
Okay.
So there's some famous cases, things like Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club and the Latin Kings. RICO offenses is how they typically get these people. Those make sense. Then there's some surprising ones.
Oh.
Key West, Florida Police Department. There were several high-ranking officers and the deputy police chief who were brought up on federal charges of a protection racket for cocaine smugglers. That's interesting.
I'm trying to wrap my brain around that. Hold on.
Yeah, they were providing protection for the drug dealers.
Right. So, I mean, that's
They were protecting them from other drug dealers and from other police officers.
And this is why this is basically the statute for organized crime.
Right.
Because it would be very easy to just think of this as, okay, but really we're just going after the people who are making the decisions, not just the soldiers. But really this is about when you're in an organization and you hold a role and that final goal is criminal, you're in for it.
Yes, exactly.
You RICO.
Exactly. Okay, this one, you'll be surprised if you don't. Maybe you already know about this, but if you don't, you'll be surprised because I was surprised. Major League Baseball in 2001. Oh, she knows. She's a Braves fan. And she's looking sad about this. Though it didn't really have anything to do with it. They were trying to devalue teams in preparation for a move. And the case went on for 2 years. It went on to arbitration. It eventually ruled in favor of Major League Baseball. Yeah. But still, it was suspicious enough they were able to bring it up on charges. And
I mean, basically, it's the movie Major League, but whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot of interesting things with sports overall.
Like FIFA?
Yeah.
Yeah. In 2015, there was a big corruption case with FIFA, and the defendants had allegedly used the organization as a front to collect millions of dollars in bribes. And so I was like, well, what happened to these people? That was like years ago. Most of them took pleas that made them guilty, but they took a plea in order to just be able to pay a fine and avoid prison entirely.
Interesting.
Still corrupt.
Well, there's a whole school of thought that plea deals are corrupt in general.
Well, that's fair. in a lot of ways because there are a lot of...
Last episode, man, we talked about this with Eileen and
Eileen Wuornos,
her partner, and how the partner got freaking immunity.
Yes.
Anyway.
When she knew, she was... Anyway, I'm going to reserve any comments because she is litigious.
She's litigious.
And I don't have any money to have anybody be litigious against me.
Nope, none.
All right, so they mentioned that CNN was relatively new and that Paul Castellano very much liked CNN.
It's so funny.
It was indeed founded in 1980, and it was indeed relatively easy to mess with your cable connection in order to create interference, which allowed them to have entrance into the mob boss's home.
That was pretty awesome.
It was so funny when he had the henchman who was there and let him in to hold the flashlight. Is there anything we can do to get you out of here faster? Hold this flashlight while I install a bug. It was awesome.
Because they had no idea. They couldn't even fathom that might be happening because they felt so invincible. But also, they just didn't have the tech know-how to realize that what they're messing with was... Anyway,
now, if
funny.
Paul Castellano had been there...
Maybe.
He might have been more suspicious because he seemed a little more, he read the Wall Street Journal and was pretty business and tech savvy, but hence he had the latest gadgets and cable and... Yeah,
he had all of the stuff.
Had all of the fun stuff. And so he might have been more suspicious, but this guy wasn't.
Nope.
Psychology break. So why did these people do it? Why did they do all this? Well, the best I could come up with was narcissism, greed, and power.
Yeah, that'd be about right.
That's about what I came up with. So Joseph Burgo had an article in Psychology Today where he's talking about it. And he says there's like two main things that define narcissism, which is no ability to empathize with other people and an inflated sense of self-importance. So I was like, yes. And then he goes on to talk about how we're kind of in this new gilded age of income inequality in the U.S., which is fair. A lot of what Bernie Sanders or who was the guy who wanted UBI?
Andrew Yang.
Yes, that's exactly who it was. The Yang Gang. Yes. It's just kind of what they've been talking about. So this might be something people are familiar with. So is there a connector with narcissism and greed? Well, Dr. Burgo seems to think so. He calls them extreme narcissists and that they fall just short of the diagnostic threshold for narcissistic personality disorder. That's, I think, very much who particularly the higher ups within the mob were, is they saw the world in very binary terms, winners and losers, and they really, really want to be winners. They need to triumph over other people, whether that's winning the contract or beating the police, escaping the police, and that they tend to resent and envy anybody who has more power or wealth than they do. And I'm like, that seems to fit. They always want more. There's never enough. You don't need $100 billion for 2,000 people to be wealthy.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, there's definitely a narcissism element to all of the people, including the soldiers who want to rise in the ranks and be noticed.
They want to become captains. Every single one of those soldiers is dreaming of being a mob boss.
Right. But it's also kind of interesting because it's a very insulated world. I mean,
that's fair.
Sure. I guess my question would be, what were the first mob bosses like? And I think that narcissism or almost a psychopath sort of, terminology would really fit. But for generations below, I'm not so sure that the same diagnosis applies because they are raised in a world that is so totally different. And it takes a lot to get out of it. Even if you watch reality TV show like Growing Up Gotti and things like that, you can see that in them. And yet they kind of started to break away from being so in line with that world, right? And you can start to see that there is a potential for empathy, as a family, even as individuals. And so when you're talking about like narcissism, that's an individual thing, but you can't talk about the mob that way. That's a whole world.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
And they did, now that you say that, they did really appreciate that what the FBI agents were doing. They're just doing their job. Our job is to beat them. Our job is to not get caught.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't hate the FBI agents. There was no personal vendetta against most of them. They would have, burned them immediately.
Yeah.
But
they'd have killed them in a heartbeat.
A heartbeat. But there wasn't a lack of empathy for the fact that they were just doing their job. So as a whole, they have a lack of empathy and a narcissism because they don't really quite understand that they're not as grandiose as they think they are. Except they did run New York City.
Right.
So I don't know how we talk about the individuals and who they were in that microcosm. Individually, I bet I would have really liked a lot of those people. Oh,
yeah. They were probably really fun at parties.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure of it. I'm sure they played piano and sang, and there was all kinds of fun to be had, know? And that's to me what makes it so weird, because I think what we have to realize is that there's a generational effect, and this is that nature versus nurture. If you grow up like that, being told this is your world, how do you break out of that?
This is how you get ahead in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And you've not really given any other options.
So what I thought was very interesting was the psychology of their slang. I mean, I've already mentioned how in stitches I was about them using all of these words and everything that are just totally Godfather, right? But I was really interested in, but how does that make them such a community? They have their own dialect. Nobody talks like this except for them. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I had to look it up, and there's a whole glossary of terminology, and I can't even pronounce most of it.
That's because it's part Italian.
Yes. Babania is heroin, as in dealing it. Babbo is a dope, an idiot. Let me scroll down this really, really long list. A capo is a ranking member of a family who heads a crew.
Yeah, they were like the captains.
They're like a captain. It's short for other things. And maybe skipper is another one. And it's actually short for an even longer word. Capodicina.
Yeah.
Right?
Italian. Yes.
Right. Of course, we know some of them just because we watch enough TV and there's enough procedurals out there that use this, right? But to clip, right, is to murder. Clock, to keep track of someone's movements. Oh, but it goes way further. An empty suit is somebody who hangs around with nothing to offer.
Ooh.
Yep. Of course, we know what fence means. Someone with a worldwide outlets to liquidate swag. If you haven't watched White Collar, that show is so great. It's all about fencing. Yeah. I mean, there's just so many words. And I thought, that's so weird because there's such a psychology behind that, behind slang and behind all of this terminology. And it kind of binds them together.
Yeah, it kind of defines who's in their in-group and who's not.
Yeah.
And that was a challenge for the FBI agents, is trying to decipher. They said they were talking in code, basically, that they didn't understand. And I bet those mobsters didn't even realize when they were on the phone that their terminology was so confusing, or would be so confusing to anybody trying to listen in, because that's just the vernacular that they had within their group.
Exactly. It made it like a code, and it's just so very interesting. And it is derived a lot from the Italian language. And what's really interesting is then to see how they talk about Sicilians. Because that's a whole beef, y'all. That's a whole beef. Beef is also listed on that list.
Yeah, I bet.
So it's just very interesting to me to see the psychology of their language and how they talked and how it's seeped into this mainstream media as movies and art has kind of used it, and then it's become kind of normal. But I'm still never going to call anybody a wise guy unironically.
No.
Just not gonna.
Well, it's just so interesting how much it seeped in and how it sounds ridiculous to us now when they use the language that they, for all practical purposes, invented. It now sounds ridiculous to us because we associate that with pop culture, whereas they associate it with their group culture.
Exactly. It's very fun.
So interesting.
It's interesting.
So interesting. So real life.
Real life.
A few people that we'd like to learn a little bit more about. Michael Franzese quit the mob and has really kind of made a entire career about it. But you mentioned people born into it.
Yeah.
And his dad was part of the mafia. So he grew up in this culture and he was kind of pulling away from it. He went to Hofstra University to try and study pre-med. He wanted to be a doctor. He was like not going to follow in the family footsteps. And then his dad went to prison.
Oh.
And his mom needed help with money.
And so
he dropped out of school and became a member of the Colombo crime family. Years later, he met a woman on the set of a movie he was producing and found some faith and decided to basically turn himself in. So he pled guilty to racketeering charges. He paid a $15 million fine to the government, spent 10 years in prison.
I can't even, hold on, $15 million fine. Wow.
The FIFA stuff makes that look like peanuts, but yeah.
I mean, I guess I get that, but it still blows me out of the water when I hear these numbers.
I know. I mean, I can't even, like, if I had $15 million to pay in fines, I would not be doing illegal things.
No, I mean,
would just be, like, enjoying my money on a beach.
I mean, yeah. Did I not just look at Amazon because I needed a new shirt and decide between, I don't know, like $19.99? I don't know.
Uh-huh.
That $20. Are we sure?
Uh-huh.
And they're dropping $15 million fines. Are you kidding me?
I know, it's bananas. He spent 10 years in prison, but they put out a hit on him, and I don't know how he survived prison, but he did. He survived prison, and then he moved to California and basically did nothing for quite a long time didn't have utilities in his name.
Probably pretty smart.
Didn't take his dog on a walk. And if he did go on a walk, it certainly wasn't 2 days in a row, and it was never the same route.
So that they couldn't clock him.
Yes, exactly. So, but now he's a lecturer, motivational speaker, has written 6 books, offers coaching in business leadership and life skills. His father, the one that he dropped out of college to support his mom when his dad went to prison, he was involved in the mafia until his 90s.
Wow.
He was sent to prison in his 90s, got out when he was 100 years old.
No.
He just died in February of 2020 at the age of 103.
Wow. I mean,
and he was active for so long.
So how did the son finally get free enough that now he can be public?
I think the mafia is not nearly as powerful as it once was. And I think maybe he became a big enough name that him disappearing
would be a problem.
You
go from incognito to totally public and then
ding, ding, ding. That's how you survive a mob hit, is you hide from them until the point where you make yourself so famous that them killing you would bring too much heat.
Now that's a good strategy.
Yeah. Not bad. So there was Curtis Silva in the documentary. He was getting the haircut at the beginning, and he's the guy who founded the Guardian Angels.
That's right.
Yeah, the group started out as 13 kids who were trying to make the subways safer. And he's really pretty much dedicated his life to this. He founded the organization in 1979 as a nonprofit. And now there's chapters throughout the U.S. and worldwide. They're all over. They just try and help people to get out of bad situations, support themselves, not rely on anybody for help, no government assistance. That's a big thing for them. Mm-hmm. And yeah. So I thought that was kind of interesting. He's got a whole website if you're interested. Of course, I will link to that on our social media. You can find us on Facebook, Killer Fun Podcast, exploring the intersection of crime and entertainment. You can find us on Twitter at Killer Fun Pod, or you can send me an email at killerfunpodcast@gmail.com, and I'll shoot you a link right back. Then we have some FBI agents. So there was Jim Kostler, who was the coordinating supervisor for the organized crime unit in New York City during this whole time. He's the one who was so excited to learn about RICO. He didn't want to go to the Cornell and spend a week away from his family when it just seemed like a big fat waste of time. And then he said it was an epiphany.
Yes, this is where the modern detective was born.
Agreed.
Right.
He's retired and still lives in New York City area and still maintains a good reputation. Here's somebody who had more of a struggle maintaining their reputation. Lynn DeVecchio, who was really like a delightful interview. And he was pretty much in charge of managing the mob informants for the FBI. And this is where the issue comes in. So he was in charge of handling Gregory Scarpa, who's not mentioned, at least not in the first episode of the documentary. And he worked for Colombo family, and he'd been an informant since the 1960s. DeVecchio is believed to be the first FBI agent accused of helping a mobster commit crimes and then cover them up. They did a 2-year investigation, and they didn't end up actually pressing any charges against him, but his reputation was sullied, and he kind of was forced to retire in 1996. In 2006, the Brooklyn district attorney indicted DeVecchio on charges that he'd helped Scarpa kill 4 people in the 80s and early 90s.
What?
Because he'd supplied confidential FBI information to Scarpa about them.
Oh my gosh.
So it's kind of RICO coming back to bite him in the behind.
Yeah.
Because he didn't do the wet work, but...
Very interesting.
But they ended up being forced to drop all the charges because there'd been an interview in the Village Voice about like in 1997 or so when the guy they had interviewed said that DeVecchio had nothing to do with that. And of course, DeVecchio wrote a book.
Of course he did. That was smart.
Because that's what you do.
That's what you do.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's hard. I can't imagine the pressures of being somebody in charge of informants because I think there's probably, how do I say this? Without sounding like I'm empathizing with the wrong side or something. Okay. I think there's likely a lot of judgment calls, a lot of discernments as a front line net to the whole scenario that you as a beat cop in charge of this, you have to kind of decide what information is more important than something else and kind of decide, okay, what's our lane and where are we staying in it? And then I've got to move forward. And there's probably enough times where you had to turn a blind eye and it's completely justified, if not still horrendous. And then eventually those lines start to blur.
Right. Well, I mean, you have to make it worth their while.
You kind of
to be
do.
your informant. So whether that's a lot of money or immunity from crimes.
Or just not turning your attention towards something.
Right. Yeah. Ignoring whatever they're doing or providing them information. You have to make it valuable for them. So I bet it was a real delicate balance.
Yeah. It sounds like a dance. It sounds like a dance.
It really does. Gloria Olarte.
Oh! Oh!
The Colombian live-in maid of Paul Castellano, whom he had an affair with. She's called the Yoko Ono of the mob.
I love
which is a late 70s, early 80s reference, if I've ever heard one.
Oh, it's fabulous. I just love it.
She told the Washington Post that because of the language barrier that she had when she first started working for Paul, that he brought home this little microcomputer translator thing, which were totally hip in the 80s and 90s. My parents were super excited to get me a translator.
Oh my
that
goodness.
I could type words into, and they, I don't know, they thought it was going to help me, and I just looked up dirty words. Whatever. But it went from orders like make coffee, set the table, do laundry, to you have pretty eyes and I like you.
That's funny.
Yeah. Castellano was brutally murdered in a street.
Aww.
And yeah, a couple days after he died, Gloria packed her bags, packed $18,000. I don't know how they found out that exact amount of money, but the Cinemaholic is reporting it as $18,000 and a porcelain clown that Paul had gifted her. She packed those things up and she went back to Colombia. And as far as anybody knows, she's still living with her mother.
Oh.
And working as a secretary in a travel agency.
Oh, how about that?
In Colombia. Yep. She was like, if Paul's not here, I'm done.
Wow.
I don't need to be here. Yeah,
well, that's probably smart.
Okay. Yeah, it probably really was. So how do mobsters make money? Well, the National Post article says the short answer is any way they can.
That's a fair statement.
Yeah. Their primary source of income is drugs. Now, people in the mob like to say that they don't have that much of an interest in drugs, that it's dirty and bad for people, and they don't like it. This article says they have three primary interests: cocaine, cocaine, cocaine.
Well, yeah, I you know, it's funny because in that little mafia terminology site, when I talked about the heroin, and it says heroin as in dealing, lucrative, but risky for mob insiders because if they're busted, long prison terms might compel them to cut a deal and squeal. And so, like, heroin is kind of considered a, no, we don't touch that. But see, cocaine, this is a high-end sort of stuff.
Yeah, the people you're selling to, they're not junkies.
They're not junkies. Isn't that weird?
Yeah. Probably the next closest would be gambling, which makes sense. Sports betting, which kind of goes along with gambling, but it's kind of got its own
thing.
Its own whole organization. Loan sharking.
Oh, yeah.
On a more local level, Pizzo.
Say what?
Is Pizzo on your Pizzo?
Okay.
Pizzo.
Wait.
Is that on your little list?
Wait, let me look it up. Hold on.
Yeah.
Pizzo.
Yeah.
No, it's not on my list.
Oh.
What is this?
It's protection money where they go into a business and they say it would be a shame if somebody burned your business down.
Oh.
Yeah.
That sounds like extortion.
It's exactly what it is. Yeah, and I think that that's what Curtis Silwa was talking about in the early part of the first episode when he's talking about working for his uncle at the butcher shop.
Right.
I'm pretty sure Pizzo was what they were negotiating.
That makes sense. And this is where, like, to the Vox article's credit, to be able to hear from people who experience that sort of side of it. Because this is where a lot of the capital came from for them to then run their big schemes. The
Right.
billion-dollar schemes.
Right. They needed seed money and they got it from the little guys. They built it into much larger money. They're increasingly involved in financial crimes, and they'd like to remind us that the mafia works by all the money flowing up. It's not a trickle-down economic situation. The money goes up. They compared it to a feudal state where peasants pay the lords.
It sounds like a multi-level marketing scheme to me.
A little bit. A little bit.
I mean, you have to admit, when we have businesses who are modeling themselves after bosses, under bosses, captains, and soldiers, we got a problem.
Wow, I really had not made that connection. I will not think of the MLMs as anything but jewelry, clothing, makeup selling mobs.
Mobs.
That's what they are. They're the mafia.
And I mean, to be fair, haven't you ever felt extorted even by an acquaintance who kind
come
of
to my party,
who kind of like dangles their friendship or dangles guilt in front of you, like, I just need to support my family, and you're like, now I'm the heathen because if I don't buy something from you, I'm the one who doesn't support my friend's family. But this is about business. This is about you selling a product. Really, if you just needed money, why don't you just ask? Like,
right. Well, and the reason the products are so expensive is not because the products are really all that luxury. It's because you have to pay an upline.
You have to pay the upline.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's only a few companies who actually built actual representative-based sales structures in a viable, very free market, normal manner. And even those still have incentive to the upline, but less so.
Right. And I would say a lot of those that were, and I'm not going to name any of them, a lot of those that were less nefarious in the past, maybe some makeup places.
Yeah.
They're moving towards that more exploitative sort of system.
Yeah, I've noticed that recently because it used to be that some of those, if you had a certain level of quote unquote downline, you actually had more responsibilities for your region. You didn't just have a downline. You became someone who they then were like, okay, you're selling and you've brought this many people in. Now you're responsible for training, for all of these things. And you could actually make a salary directly from the company at that point.
Right. Exactly. Yes. It used to be that those companies would pay the people who'd proven themselves to be excellent salespeople to train the people who were going out and doing the actual selling. And it used to be that you could make a living just selling.
You could just make a living just selling, or like a part-time living. And if you went full-time, you might then get promoted, literally promoted to a regional representative.
Right. All of them now, I would say almost without exception, push you to sign up people under you more than encouraging you to sell a superior product to your friends.
Yep, it's true. And it's so sad because some of those brands were just great.
Yes. And if they're still great brands, the price has skyrocketed.
Oh my gosh. I just saw prices recently. Can I tell you? I just saw them recently.
Were you shocked?
Were you shocked? Shocked.
Yeah.
Shocked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can go to Ulta.
Okay, but literally you can go to Etsy. Like, okay, so I had a makeup brand thing. And you know what? The person, totally delightful, Was it fun to hang out with friends on Zoom and do something? Absolutely. It was way fun. And the product, the samples that I got in the mail, they're absolutely wonderful. And I have like rosacea. I mean, it could be very bad. And these were very, very soothing. But they were so expensive. And I really was shocked at that because I was like, I can't even. So that said, I have a little company on Etsy that I am absolutely in love with, all of their products, and they're always so helpful. And I'm like,
awesome. Well, I think the Etsy brand, you can tell us. We'll give them a free plug.
Let's give them a free plug.
Since they're not explaining anybody.
All right. Atlanta Body Culinary.
Awesome. And I'll share that on our...
Yeah, we got to share that. Atlanta Body Culinary. They make skin moisturizing and other kind of things for all sorts of people, including rosacea and eczema, like different. Those are different. And so there's different. But they also have things like bug spray that is all natural, that really works. And they have shampoo that is amazing and
awesome.
The best.
Super cool. I don't mind plugging a small business like that.
Yeah, let's do it.
They mentioned a black bag operation.
I love this. This is my favorite part.
Okay, so that's like a legitimate term, and it refers to clandestine entries into a structure of some sort in order to get human intelligence, basically a bug. And this is basically breaking and entering.
I love it.
Yeah. So it was common for the FBI to do these black bag operations in order to gain information. They would basically just go snoop on somebody that they thought was doing bad things.
Now they had a warrant.
So, before 1972, without a warrant.
Ooh, interesting.
Because the Supreme Court said that black bag jobs by the FBI were unconstitutional on June 19th, 1972.
Without a warrant.
So now they have to obtain warrants.
Nice.
And that's why they had such a hard time getting the warrants on these mobsters. So once they had the warrants, then, getting them actually into the homes, another issue.
Yeah. Cut their cable, mess with phone lines, have a fight with a dog.
Yes. And so these homes, they weren't empty ever. There was always somebody home. It's like they're in quarantine. There was always somebody there. There's always somebody in my house.
It's true.
Always. So encyclopedia.com gives us a little information about bugs. And they're called bugs because they're tiny. I was trying to figure out why they were called bugs. And it's because they're little. And they go in places you can't see.
That makes sense. I kind of always thought it was derived from like the cliche, a fly on the wall.
That makes sense. I don't know which came first, a fly on the wall or bugs.
Huh. Okay, listeners, you've got to tell us.
Yeah, exactly.
We're Googled out. You've got to go research this and tell us. Fly on the wall or bug? Which one came first?
They're basically just listening devices that can be added and removed. They might be added to telephones. They might be added, like in the case where they put it in Castellano's house, where they put it in the cable box. It was just it was a microphone with a transmitter on it.
I think my favorite one was the car. That's my favorite. They put it in a car, and it's like a whole deal. Is that not the first episode?
That was in the first episode.
Oh, see, this is what I get for watching the whole thing.
I'm trying to play it off like I know exactly what you're talking about, and I'm like,
so we're covering the first episode. All right. So in the docuseries, as you go along, you see a whole nother black bag operation dealing with a car, and it is an absolute hoot.
Awesome.
You gotta watch it.
Well, I'm gonna have to watch that. Mm-hmm. When they have a radio transmitter, they can be found.
Yes.
That makes them more detectable. So once the mafia realize they're being bugged, they're able to do sweeps and find them. But microphones are much harder to detect if you can hide them, because if they're hardwired to a surveillance system somewhere else, they're basically impossible to find.
Yeah, you can't find them at all.
Yeah, you have plugs in the wall, you have lamps, they read the same as lamps. It seems like wiretapping should only go back, a few decades, right?
I mean, it feels like it. I mean, I don't know if you can consider putting a bug in somebody's phone wiretapping.
Well, if you're going to go wiretapping, then you have to go much further back. So April White of Smithsonian Magazine did an interview with Brian Hockman, who is a professor of English and American Studies at Georgetown University. And he has done a bunch of research on electronic surveillance. And it predates the telephone by a long time.
Interesting.
So the first person convicted of wiretapping was a stockbroker named D.C. Williams in 1864.
What were they tapping?
He was doing like the corporate telegraph lines and selling the information that he got from, Morse code to stock traders. He's basically doing insider trading. I'm like, that's awesome.
That is so funny.
He's like, he got convicted of it, but like, how smart was he to kind of think of that?
I mean, really, people will find a way to be nefarious,
seriously.
won't they?
Yes.
They just will.
The law enforcement didn't use it until really the Prohibition era. That's when they finally started getting this tool into use on a regular sort of basis. Today, most of the wiretapping warrants are for criminal investigations and not national security ones. People are always worried, is the NSA listening to me? I mean, they have to have a warrant, and mostly it's criminal, but that has a little bit of an issue too, because for a long time, there's the war on drugs that tended to target Black and Latino people more frequently because they could suspect them. It tended to be a little racist.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly a fair, equal attack on the drugs and their impact in the country. The war on drugs was kind of a struggle, but yeah, I think people do forget that you have to have a warrant to listen. But I do think people get concerned because, when people talk about chatter, the thing is that so much of it is being recorded, even though it can't be going to listen to without the warrant.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I don't get the impression that Brian Hockman is a big fan of smart speakers.
Yeah, I would guess that too.
Yeah, he says they're essentially wiretaps.
Yeah.
They're constantly listening. It's like corporate surveillance. And yeah, they listen to you. You can get the things that you want. You might get a better price on something that you want. You might find something unusual that you've been looking for, which is maybe, not so nefarious, not perfect, but not ultimately all that harmful. But where does that data go? Who else has access to it? What are they recording? You don't know.
You really don't know.
All right. And that's all I have.
Oh,
which I think is plenty.
I think it's plenty.
I mean,
we didn't even watch the whole thing. We didn't talk. I only went into episode 2 like once, right? And so we had plenty to talk about. This series,
we had plenty to talk about. I skipped at least several of my articles. I was like, we can just keep going. I will skip this. I will just post it on social media and it'll be fine. Yeah. I mean, the mob is just so huge. I'm sure we'll talk about the mob again at some point.
We may just have to go in and do Fear City too. Like the second episode. Yeah. Ooh. We may just have to do every daggum episode.
Okay. Well, we can consider that.
We might have to consider that. Ooh.
But we can't do that next time.
We can't do that next time though.
No, because I haven't seen it, but you have. I found it, suggested it to you. You watched it and were like, this is crazy. We have to talk about this. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't use that word. This is wild. This is unexpected. I got to use the right terminology.
Or else you have to put a quarter in the jar thing. Okay.
That's right. And I'm doing better, but that's the first time I've said it in a wild episode of all kinds of baffling stuff.
You know, I haven't used the word crazy as much as I used to, but you know what I did is I just changed it out for another word.
Well, and that's fine. And that's what you should do. You don't want to be the lazy and do the shorthand. You want to say what you're actually saying. It's shocking. It's wild. It's unusual.
Yeah.
It's baffling.
But usually,
these are more descriptive words.
Those are much better words. But usually I just say something like, it's macadamia.
Yeah.
Because it's nuts. And nuts means crazy. And so I haven't done as good job.
That's all right. See, and I have less of an issue with it now. There's a plenty of issue. I try to limit it in my vocabulary as much as possible, but I have less of an issue when it's referring to a situation than when it's referring to a person. So my husband and I covered a protege artist on my other podcast, The Mountains and the Sea, and I really fussed at him when he tried to call her crazy. I'm like, she's not crazy. She's wild. She's free. She's unexpected. You don't use the word crazy. She's not mentally ill. And even if she is mentally ill, that is not an indictment of her character.
Right. Agreed. Totally. And when you're talking about a situation, you're right. It's a little bit more balmy to just say that it's crazy. But this movie, that's macadamia.
Yeah. It's bananas. So we haven't even said what it is. It's Tickled, a 2016 documentary. David Farrier covers weird stories, but he gets much more than he anticipates when he tries to get more information about the world of competitive tickling.
Yeah, we'll just let that rest.
Competitive tickling. We're just going to say competitive tickling.
Okay, just watch it. Just watch it. Just watch it. You've got to watch it. You got to watch it, and then we got to see you next time, and you got to watch it.
That's right. So thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. You know, we know you make a choice when you listen to us. We don't just come on the radio. You know what you should do? You should absolutely tell a friend, because it's way more fun when you listen with a friend. And then you can talk about how we fail at not saying the word crazy. And you can talk about the mafia, and you can tell us how weird we are for wanting to cover the world of competitive tickling.
That's macadamia, man. It's macadamia. Join us next time. We cannot wait.
That's right. Until then, be safe, be kind, and wash your hands.
Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum. Da, da, da.